I first met Chris in 1999 or 2000. We were on a program together in London, and if you recall those heady days of e-commerce or digital business, as things were everything was going digital, and if your company wasn't there, then you were just going to die, and the overhypeness of it was legendary. As you know, the stock market crashed for the dot-com boom, as it was so called, a few years later. But in my first meeting with Chris on the stage, his company had put out a publication called The Great Leap Forward, Launching E-Business at the Large Corporation. And I still have my copy of it from that time. And backstage, I remember talking with Chris, and I said, this is really good in the otherwise tsunami of crap that is being written about this right now. And I think I said crap. Yeah. But it really remains a great manual for corporations that were finding their way forward with digital business. And then in some years later, we ran into each other again in Washington, D.C. EAB now leads practices, and Indiana University is a member of about 5 of these practices. So the provost as the chief academic officer on the Bloomington campus, Chancellor Padar on the IUPUI campus. There is a chief academic officer's practice where research is done across universities, aggregated, and it provides a forum for those officers to talk to each other. Likewise, Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer Mary Frances McCourt is a member of the Business Officers Practice. And IU, along with some of our colleagues in the Big Ten and a few places, helped establish the Chief Information Officer Practice. EAB continues to do what I consider some of the market-leading research in providing insight that is actionable and usable. And I was really pleased when I reached out to Chris and say, hey, could we get you to come out for our statewide IT conference? Chris is a veteran of a number of corporate jobs, been with Corporate Advisory Board and now Executive Advisory Board for well over 15 years. He is a graduate of Cornell University with a degree, as I recall, in American literature and biology, if that tells you about the value of a liberal arts education. So let's give a big warm welcome to EAB's Chris Miller.
Thank you very much. I'm Chris Miller with EAB. I'm very honored for the invitation, very grateful to be able to come out here on a day whose weather was so nice. It must have been devised by your meteorology department on behalf of your admissions department. Hopefully you had lots of prospective freshmen visiting today. Special thanks to Brad, Tsunami of Crap. I wish I had thought of that title myself. Brad, if you're interested in licensing it, if we ever come out with an anthology of EAB's lifetime works, I think that would be a fitting title for it. But I have a half hour to try and compress about 18 months worth of research, thousands of conversations with provosts, chief business officers, and presidents into about a half hour. So I will fail miserably at that task. But what I wanted to do in the next 30 minutes or so was to give you a sense about which of the capabilities that you and your teams have been assiduously trying to stand up these last 5 or 10 years, which of the systems and data capabilities your internal partners and clients on campus may be newly open to using for constructive purposes. So maybe a way to think about this, if Florence Hudson was telling us about how the Internet of Things might affect the long-term future of big data, my job maybe is to tell you what provosts and CBOs are thinking about the intermediate term future of small data on campus. And maybe to do that, I can explain just a little bit about what my organization does and how we work with universities. As Brad said, we are a membership organization. We work with about 800 colleges and universities, most of them in the US, a mix of public and private, research-intensive universities and masters. We also work with maybe the top 50 or 60 universities in Canada as well. But I have a fun job. I like to think that Charlie Rose would swap jobs with me because I spend my days and weeks interviewing academic and business leaders at schools like the Indianas, trying to find out what their big up-at-night issues are. So I will talk to a couple of dozen provosts every week and ask them to finish the sentence. What's keeping me up at night this year is fill in the blank. And I try to get them to riff and elaborate on what areas of opportunity, what areas of challenge that they are feeling, where would they like to inflect and elevate organizational performance over the next couple of sessions. And depending on what topics come out most frequently, most urgently, we will select the top 3 of them and dedicate teams of our research staff. We have the pleasure of working with about 600 very talented and dedicated colleagues. We'll assign teams of 3 or 4 staff to spend 9 or 12 months doing literally hundreds of interviews, trying to boil the higher education ocean, looking for provenly effective, replicable practices that we can then report back to our member institutions to consider adopting on campus. But something really unusual started to happen a couple of years ago. So for the last 3 cycles, pretty much ever since MOOC mania died down from a white-hot distraction to merely a sort of red-hot initiative on campus, when I've been asking that starter question to provosts, what's keeping you up at night, the kinds of topics that you see here about academic decision support started percolating up to the top. So you see on the left there, in a topic poll that we had put out asking provosts to assign their level of interest, would they give an A grade for a slate of about 40 topics? You can see the kinds of topics that came out. Funding strategic priorities and lean budget times. Working smarter, not harder. Provosts definitely wanted to change faculty behaviors by changing the types of information that they were using to make budget and academic plans. And I wouldn't expect you to read anything into our metrics, but 78% of chief academic officers agreeing that a single topic deserved an A. I could not get 78% of chief academic officers to agree that we are in the state of Indiana or that today is Monday. That amount of galvanization around a topic is really quite something in the academy. We saw an equal and opposite trend in our chief business officer program, the one that we call the Business Affairs Forum. Again, very much focused on the instrumentation of university decision-making. There was topics like the university dashboard or running the lean university. So as we did more calls, as we saw so many institutions of different types focusing on these issues, we got a lot of the university leaders on the phone and we were asking them to elaborate. What are your objectives? What are the types of organizational sinews that you need to build? Where should we be doing our best practice research on? And after about 3 dozen of these calls, we came to realize that there was a very predictable pattern in them. So we'd get a provost, or we would get a chief business officer, or we would get a CIO on the phone, and we would say, what's your big endeavor for the year? And they said, oh, well, we are going to become a data-driven university. And we go, that's terrific. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? And then very quickly, we began to discern what we came to call the Chinese menu pattern. It was almost like people were picking one of the words from each column. Well, we're going to be a data-informed analytics institution. And then after that, well, we're going to become an evidence-leveraged decision-making organization. And so what became clear to us was a couple of things. One is that there was sincerity. These people really did want to become more data-driven, to use data better than they were. But what was equally clear to us is that even though they had sort of memorized the stump speech, the PowerPoint presentation, when we asked, what exactly do you want to know about becoming data-driven, they were saying anything. I just came back off of a stage like this, celebrating the new data warehouse investment that we had made. When I got off the stage, I was calling myself a fraud because I didn't have the slightest idea about what we wanted that to operationalize too. So EAB decided that provosts, deans weren't doing the best job articulating what this abstraction of the data-driven university was meant to mean. So we tried to flip the inquiry around a little bit. If you don't know what data-driven means, tell us what not being data-driven feels like. What are the pain points on campus that you're looking to make go away with better information? And there we started to get some more specific answers. And I'll offer these to you as evidence, I guess, is the sources of the tailwinds that we think that you are going to be on the receiving end of as more and more people across campus are demanding better and better data. So one set of university decision makers was telling us that we really need better data because we are struggling to answer questions from our boards. In many public institutions are following the path of the state of Tennessee. Tennessee, as you may know, followed closely by the state of Ohio, are kind of trailblazing a path for the country where their state board of regents is demanding that all of the universities, from the flagship in Knoxville all the way down to the regionals, are going to be reporting on some of the metrics that you see in their success dashboard. And so when we talk to institutions here, the questions are, we need to figure out how to get straight from the machine, single version of the truth data, and the problem is that we have no data governance mechanism. We have 38,000 different ways of measuring student progress, and we frankly don't have the resources to clean up and scrub the data that we have. So as more and more public institutions are preparing for a world where student progress dashboards are going to be a big part of the accountability lens, we're hearing more inference in funding dashboards for performance funding. The story of private schools was a little bit different, and I'll disguise the name to protect the innocent, or in this case, the guilty, I should say. But there was a research-intensive private university in the Northeast, and we talked to their CIO, who had just had a Boolean connector added to his title. He was the CIO and head of business intelligence in the university. And I saw his business card, and I saw the "and BI" written in pen or crayon or Sharpie, and I said, how did you get this extra length on your title? And he told their "but for the grace of God go I" story. So the new president, the relatively new president, had convened their board of trustees meeting, and they had a 20-minute plug on the agenda celebrating the institution's efforts to try to recruit low-income, high-ability, first-generation students from the Southwest. And there were lots of terrific graphics and video testimonials of students that they had had. A trustee raised his hand and asked the president how many low-income, high-ability students from the Southwest the school had actually admitted in the last year, and whether that was on course or at, above, or below target that they had set. Well, according to the CIO, after that question, it took them the rest of the day, from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m., just to be able to verify that it would take them 6 weeks to go back to the enrollment department to answer the question, how are we doing against what the president has said is one of our biggest strategic endeavors? So from either end here, whether it's sort of externally legislature-driven accountability metrics or internally being able to define and track progress against mission goals, that's the kind of emphasis that we're hearing from the very top from the presidents. But maybe a click down at the provost and a dean's cabinet level, what we are hearing is that there is a self-sustaining hunger for better decision support information to take us out of the Groundhog Day of being stuck in unproductive, unfruitful, inefficient planning and budgeting discussions. And so again, we heard this story in many different variations of the same theme all across the country. I'll just tell it in the voice of a particular private university. In the Philadelphia area, they had 2 successive years of missing enrollment targets. As a result, there was a $15 million budget shortfall that the board had ordered rectified. So the provost convened all of the major stakeholders, the deans, the faculty senate, the CBO, and they said, let's come up with a way to bridge the budget gap in ways that don't tear up the faculty social contract, that don't affect the student experience. Well, they put the numbers out there, and immediately the deans gravitated towards quarreling about overhead allocations. Hey, wait a sec, how do we allocate joint appointment benefits? And my library allocation is too high. And again, this was unproductive because there wasn't very much that they could do about the cost of the library. The faculty senate contributed, hey, why don't we cut from central administration first? Actually, IT would be a good place to start. CBO immediately came back to say, hey, we're already understaffed for our workload. Plus, most of the money, 70 cents of every education dollar, is actually in the classroom. And the department chairs got out the microscope, the magnifying glass, and were able to find discrepancies in the data. They would find enrollment figures that were wrong, and of course, if there is one bad apple in the basket, none of the other data could be trusted. IR and IS are called into the table. They say it will take weeks to confirm the numbers, and when it made that trip around the table, the only thing that the provost was able to decide is that, hey, at current course and speed, we're not going to have this recommendation done in the planning window that we have. This is taking far too long. Across the board cuts, it is. Nobody would say that indiscriminate pro rata cuts is the way to make strategy, but because of the paucity of data at a lot of tables like this, that's what it's becoming to. And so what we are hearing now, though, is to get universities more transparent externally and more productive about resource planning internally, is that a lot of IT work and a lot of data governance effort is getting focused on making the switch from traditional funds accounting towards something that might be more like planning, academic decision support. So most of the systems that have been created to manage higher education finances and planning have been for the purpose of auditing. They wanted to give data to auditors to make sure that there was compliance of block expenditures, to be able to ensure that dollars were being spent for approved purchases. This was keep me out of jail data. And instead, what we're hearing as a groundswell of support is that we need that same data manipulated differently, presented in ways that are actionable for deans and chairs, that will help inform resource allocation decisions. How many courses do I offer? Who's teaching them? How many majors should I be trying to attract to my department? And that will better focus and associate cost by activity and outcomes so that everybody, from the president to the provost, provost to the deans, all the way down to the chairs and students, can show that the capacity that we have is aligned with our avowed mission goals. And one of the people who's out on the conference circuit really banging the drum on this is the former provost of Arizona State, Betty Phillips, who's basically saying is that our traditional legacy system separation of performance-related information from financial data prevents a clear understanding of income, expense, and results. They obscure education's true costs. Without such information, institutional managers simply cannot make wise decisions. And so what we're hearing is more and more deans, more and more provosts asking more and more IT, IR, and business intelligence groups to focus time to spend more money about migrating systems or developing, decision support capabilities to get from the left of that slide to the right. But we were watching very intently the literally scores of universities that said that making that migration was one of their big goals in 2015. But unfortunately, the frustration stories that we encountered dramatically outnumbered the success stories. And what we heard too often was a variation on the story that we've tried to describe here. I don't know if any of you have binoculars to see it, but we came to hear almost like kind of like a country western song. If we heard the first stanza, we could kind of predict what was going to happen in the rest of the song. But very often when we were asking people to relate what was going on in your business intelligence and your decision support efforts, well, the starter pistol, as it were, was fired. The president, the provost, the CIO would convene a group like this and say, our institution is going to become data-driven. And we're going to back it up in the second bullet because we are spending a lot of money on BI tools and staff. We'll double the size of the IR department. But we add on these staff, we add on these tools without a clear direction about what they're expected to deliver. So then we invite in stakeholders. What are your analytics priorities? What metrics do you want? What decisions do you want supported? Universities are nothing if not inclusive. This can include hundreds of meetings with thousands of stakeholders, all without, in many cases, reaching consensus about what ought to be measured. So one of the areas that IT found to be most under-resourced was staff and time to fix data quality issues. So they were aggregating data from source systems. They had been configured in strange ways. There were lots of open fields. People were saying that they had underestimated by a factor of 10 or 100 the amount of hours that it would take to necessary to scrub and clean the data. And as this spills over, IR, whose day jobs of external reporting and assessment hasn't gone away, they can't handle all of the analytical inquiries, and in many cases, the IT staff is getting taken away from their day jobs to do to answer one-off analytical queries. So all this at the end, without a clear direction about the output, without consensus about what decisions they had wanted to inform, without enough resources to fix the predictable data quality issues, when they presented the finished product, the single version of the truth, the executive dashboards to the deans, and users found it very easy to criticize, even easier to ignore the results, and all at the end of 18 months worth of effort of millions of dollars in director opportunity costs. Too often we found IT groups getting blamed for a failed quote-unquote technology project. And again, so it was this sort of cycle of disappointment that we were hearing far too often from our IT leadership, from our BI units. And so what my organization had tried to do over the last year was to help develop best practices and templates to migrate decision support away from this mindset of being an IT project to being what it really should be, of being more of an enterprise process. And if any of you are interested during or after this presentation, all of you have access to all of our content at EAB.com. It takes all of about 90 seconds to sign up for a password. But we have been assiduously working to create resources helping you to herd the cats on campus about what to measure. What are the analyses that you ought to stand up for high-quality academic decision support? We've built a starter data dictionary trying to give a baseline about how you might want to standardize critical figures like enrollment numbers or faculty hours. And then also activities for data governance groups and for the people in charge of doing data quality audits. So all of those resources are available to you and all of your colleagues, but what Brad thought might be useful for us today would be to focus on that leftmost box there. What are the specific kinds of analyses that the very best institutions are providing to and expecting of every single department? So we had spent an awful long time, the better part of the last 18 months, doing probably on the order of 300 interviews with all different kinds of institutions, trying to look with a very objective, dispassionate eye about what kinds of analyses faculty found useful and what kinds of analyses senior university leaders found important about continuously reallocating academic resources. And one of the enemies in this process was a sort of proliferating dashboard. No one but no one can make sense of a dashboard that has 1,000 metrics in it. So we were really trying to look with a disciplined eye about what the finite number of the most important analytics are. We test drove this with a lot of different schools, but at the end of this effort, what we have been evangelizing to our own membership is that before you charter your IR department to do anything too exotic about coming up with reports about how many left-handed Cuban first-generation pre-med students you may have, before you do any of that, make sure that you have bulletproofed these 10 critical fundamental analyses. And again, the watchword that we are using is that they are no regrets analyses, numbers that every single faculty person, every single chair should know about their own program and should use when they are making planning and budgeting. So in its natural habitat, it would take probably, the runtime of this presentation is longer than the movie Lawrence of Arabia, so we don't have enough time for that, but I will highlight, I guess, a handful of the metrics that, when presented to faculty, have really been in that win-win quadrant of constructive faculty engagement and really meaningful change in how academic resources are organized. So I'll start in the upper left here, direct instructional costs per student credit hour. Probably most people in this room who have anything to do with ERP or finance or HR systems would know how hard the diagram schematicized on this slide is. It is really hard to get down to the department level of associating direct instructional costs with student credit hours. Finance codes don't match the department data. They change a lot. There may be category name changes, organizational changes. A lot of times the student information systems that house curriculum and student records were built on the fly, and the short-term fixes that we make high-quality data all but impossible. And even if you're able to solve the two things on the left, it is very difficult to get critical data about faculty, research, and service, because a lot of times it is tracked at the unit level. I went to a school in Erie, Pennsylvania, and they were very excited to share their faculty release longitudinal data with us so we could add it to a benchmarking effort. And I gave the URL where they could send it to our data group, and what they handed me was a stack of manila folders with Sharpies written all over them. That was the database of faculty release time. But anyway, what we had heard loud and clear, though, is that even though it is very hard, there are few things more important that the IS, the IR, and the finance team can hold hands to do than doing all the crosswalks for the analyses. And the goal here, what we learned from the most effective planning organizations, is that it is critically important to focus academic leaders on what might be called controllables. And what controllables are the things that are not related to central university overhead. And so if you were actually counting this up here, you would want to get a level at the history department, at the political science, at the biology department. You would get all instructional expenses. Those would be faculty salary and benefits allocated across courses taught. You would want to look at academic department payroll data to get administrative costs about local administrative staff, and then any other direct costs, direct department spend on goods and services and the like. Critically important to exclude from this analysis are overall university expenses, things like the library, things like student services, things like central admin. If we closed the history department on Bloomington, then that would not change the expense of what we are spending on the football stadium. And so too often what we had found was that anytime you started to include central overhead expenses, all the faculty would focus on would be the amount and the unfairness of the overhead allocation. Getting these down to controllable department costs that actually might be influenced by faculty decisions is the right way to go. Here's why the effort is worth it, because of the more productive conversations that it engenders for faculty. So all of these are data actually that we worked out with a group of 7 public research universities that we had done as kind of a proof of concept of department level analytics. But if you do that analysis, the things that deans are able to do is that they can array all of their portfolio of departments by instructional costs. And you can see here all of the handful of the programs for College of Arts and College of Sciences. And the goal here isn't necessarily to prove the obvious, that the cost per student credit hour for theater is higher than it is for, let's say, communications, or that chemistry might be more expensive than liberal arts. But rather, what the deans are very excited about doing is to look at these data to try and detect unnoticed trends or egregious outliers. So the deans that we worked with, they had grouped all of the programs in their particular colleges into a sort of peer departments, and they looked for anomalies. And here was one example. There was a dean of the College of Arts and Sciences who detected an unexpected anomaly in the instructional costs of their sociology and poli-sci departments. To this dean's mind, these two programs were siblings. They attracted similar quality of students, they had comparable rates of discounting, they had comparable levels of research and scholarly output. So the dean was very surprised to see that they seemed to be going in different directions. Now, previously, they may have just stopped at that initial number, and then the war of anecdotes would have begun. But armed with this data, they were able systematically to try and test hypotheses. What is explaining the cost divergence in these two programs? So one theory might be that, well, maybe sociology is just teaching more students. Well, yes, that turned out to be part of it. Well, maybe the answer is faculty mix. Maybe we are hiring in more tenured faculty than poli-sci. That turned out not to be the case. But as they went further and further down, root cause by root cause, they were able to find that average class size was a point that they had really seen divergence over the last 5 years. Average class size had stayed about 29 in the sociology department, but it had dropped down to 15 in political science. And when they tried to explain that factor, they found out that the reason is that over that time, the political science department had launched an upper division multidisciplinary specialized track that had resulted in the creation of 10 new active courses. So that really was the reason. Adding to the course catalog had reduced the number of students per course. So, we asked, does that mean that you as the dean are going to request or require that you roll back the specialty course track? The answer that we got was absolutely not. In fact, she said, my field is statistical biology. I don't know the first thing about political science, but what I am saying is that you in the political science department had requested money from my budget to increase the amount of graduate student stipends. I don't have enough money to do both of those things, so you guys have to go back to the faculty lounge and debate which of those two priorities better advances your goals. Would you want to spend those resources on graduate stipends, or do you think the multidisciplinary track better reflects scholarship? So being able to quickly divine where there are changes over time, outliers, concerning trends, discrepancies, has been very, very powerful for a lot of academic decision makers. A second area where there has been a lot of interest about marrying faculty decisions to space and enrollment planning has been in the clutch of analyses that we're grouping under the category of shaping class size. And the reason why this is so consequential is that class size matters an awful lot, not just for student experience, but financially as well. So in all of the analyses that we did with all these schools, you could see that there was really a disproportionate impact. If you're looking to inflect a program economics, it is much more impactful to add students than it is to replace a more expensive tenured faculty with a less expensive adjunct faculty. So I go to many, many groups where I listen and sort of play objective referee over discussions about the desirability, the finances, the ethics of utilizing more adjuncts. But what I often find myself recommending is that, boy, if you switched out a tenured instructor and put in an adjunct, whatever the merits of doing that, if you're doing it purely from a financial lens, you're only saving about $4,000 per term. Look at this on the other hand. If you could figure out a way to add one student, that would be an extra $900 in revenue per course. If you could figure out a way to get 5 students, $4,500. So what is less disruptive culturally? Switching out adjuncts for tenures or figuring out ways that you can adjust the curriculum or enrollment caps to nudge up the number of students. And you can see is that we found pretty predictably is that the break-even point, the moment at which a course goes from requiring a cross-subsidy to generating a surplus, is right around 10 students. So recognizing that and where people are trying to get better data into the hands of faculty is to figure out whether their courses are small by design for intentional quality or environmental reasons, or whether they're unintentionally small just because we have been sort of resubmitting last year's schedule without looking at student demand trends. So there are some courses that are smaller, getting smaller, and they're just better perceived as facts of life. So pedagogy, Indiana has one of the best music programs in the world. I would go out on a limb and say that your music faculty don't think that it would be productive to have flipped classrooms of 500 piano students all practicing at once. There are health programs that have accreditation limits. There are low demand majors. I was at the University of Kansas, and it broke my heart that the home of Rock Chalk Jayhawk only has 15 geology majors now. But there are some that are facts of life, but there are some small courses that are the result of faculty choices. Do we have a lot of specialty tracks in the upper division? Have we been making our prerequisites more complicated? Are there a number of electives that don't really count towards majors? If I am adding courses faster than I am adding students, that sort of builds in our class size difficulty. So here's an analysis marrying registrar, SIS, and faculty planning data that has proved very, very powerful to get into the hands of associate deans and department chairs. And this is a class size distribution analysis. The way that we are seeing provosts ask every single department to engage with this data is to array all of the student credit hours produced by the department. This is done at an institutional level. We recommend doing it all the way for every single department. but all of the bars that you see up add up to 100, and the percentage that you see in any given bar tells me what fraction of the 100% of my credit hours are produced in courses of different enrollment size. So the way you'd read this graphic is that 27% of my student credit hours are in courses between 21 and 25, 17% in 36 to 50, and so on. But seeing this histogram and seeing how the bars increase or decrease over size produces some really interesting insights. So there at the far left, I had said before that courses with fewer than 10 students require a subsidy. So deans have been asking chairs, look at your department and tell me if those bars at the far left are getting bigger or smaller or are collectively above 20%. So if that number in the far left, very small classes from 0 to 5, if that number had been creeping up, that is an indication to ask faculty, are our current independent study, our lab, our internship policies sustainable? Have we become smaller than we can afford? Are there ways that we might combine, let's say, independent studies that have similar themes into a single small course? Then if you can get a certain number of courses up to 5, then the next question might be, how can you nudge courses up above the break-even of 10%? We found one school in Philadelphia that told us that if we could reduce the number of courses below 10 students from its current level of 30% to below 20%, that we might be able to give raises to faculty that you hadn't seen in a couple of years. That got a lot of people thinking about how they might change major requirements or consolidate courses. And I thought this was a very clever sort of incentive that an SEC school, a flagship university in the Deep South, came up. So the flagship university was frustrated because they had won all kinds of EDUCAUSE awards for one of their so-called flipped classroom models, the lower division courses that meet once a week and then have lots of work that is done self-paced over the internet and meeting in smaller discussion sections. They'd gotten a lot of awards for that. The provost had set up a seed fund asking other disciplines to come and copy the success story. I think it was in sociology, but come do what they did in sociology for your discipline in widgetology or biology. No one availed themselves of those resources, so that was the provost frustration. So the CBO, sniffing an opportunity in the air, had said, my big frustration is that faculty keep proposing very small programs. The incentive, the sort of compact that they made is that they showed this data to all of the different department chairs that were requesting new programs or niche upper division tracks. And they said, if you can figure out a way to restructure classes or lower division offerings such that you can move some of the credit hours from the 36 to 50 up to the 76 to 100, then I will give you a corresponding number of courses on the lower end of the scale. So in other words, if there was kind of a student credit hour neutral way of designing the courses, making the big ones very big so that we could afford a lot of smaller classes, this was the way that the campus came up as a way of continuing to fund pedagogical innovation without breaking the bank. And I can tell you that this has been transformational in faculty engagement. So we worked with Iowa State University. They had shown data like this to their faculty. They were very concerned about six-year graduation rates. So their School of Journalism did not look good in some of those metrics. So they got the faculty together and they systematically went through and used a rubric about what types of small courses might be ones that they could pare back without affecting student experience or faculty research. So they looked for specialized tracks. They looked for 3-course sequences, for so-called free electives or independent studies. And at the end of this exercise, started by that data, they decided to consolidate a number of degree tracks. They got rid of 16 specialty courses that didn't have diploma impact. That means that it didn't get students closer to graduation. And they reduced 4 other courses in frequency. And by doing so, they freed up so much extra faculty time that they were able to do 2 competing goals at once. They reduced the teaching load from a 3-2 to a 2-2, and they credit it as one of the big factors in improving a 6-year graduation rate from 47 to 61%. And one last analysis that I'll say has been just catnip to institutions, particularly those on a so-called RCM budget model. as soon as you start associating budget dollars with student enrollment patterns, there has been a great deal more emphasis for more granular information about enrollment trends. And one of the analyses that has really been getting a lot of faculty conversation is to show the instructional balance of trade, if you will, between departments. I teach my own students, but I also teach other department students. My students also take courses in other people's departments. A lot of times it requires a lot of perseverance for faculty to get actionable intelligence on those knowable numbers. So this graphic here, we've been calling by the somewhat bureaucratic, bloodless shorthand of the curriculum interdependency matrix. But deans have really gotten excited about it because it answers a couple of questions. So imagine that I am the dean of the Kelley School of Business. I could look at something like this, and I could read the vertical column, and it would answer the questions, what students did my business department professors teach? So you can see in the middle there, 9,000, about 60% of the student credit hours I produced were taught to business majors, about 3,200, about 30% to arts and sciences and so forth. But then I can also cross-tab that with the question, where did my business majors take courses inside and outside of the business school? So again, 60% are inside the business school, but plenty in arts and sciences, plenty in education and engineering. So one of the really exciting moments that we saw is that, we can't do it in this slide, but when you do that as a time series longitudinally, what really came up was that engineering students were taking more and more business classes. And I wish you could have been in that room with me. There was an engineering dean who was straight from Central Casting. I think he was an extra in Apollo 13, but he had the flat top, he had the pocket protector, and he was going, engineering is the only toughest major on campus, and we keep those guys so busy, you have to take 128 credits just to get an engineering degree. He was astonished that these overworked engineering students were making time to add extra business school courses. So he got together, he got the data about what exactly were the business courses that they were taking. Anybody want to take a guess about what business courses the engineering students were taking? Sorry? Day trading. It wasn't quite that long ago. Right. Entrepreneurship, thank you. It's very bright here, so I can't reward. It was from the middle aisle. Entrepreneurship classes, the engineers wanted to graduate in. They didn't want to go to work for Honeywell. They wanted to launch their own startup. So this was, probably 5 or 10 people were shouting that out from the audience. I assure you this was news to the bulk of the engineering department. And this prompted a deeper analysis, and long story short, at the end of the day, they were able to create a dual service specialty track, tech entrepreneurship management, open both to business students and to engineering students. And they created a separate specialty track in a single term comprised of 10 courses, but they were able to reuse with minor modifications 8.5 of those 10 courses. So this was warp speed by academic standards. A new program stood up that had a proven student base, minimizing the time and expense to launch. So that's what we're hearing. Most of the emphasis that we are hearing is help faculty make more intentional decisions about how many courses to offer, about how many students we want in the courses. On the roadmap, where we may be going is better information about space utilization and research. But what we have been telling all of our schools is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And before you go off and getting too exotic, that really the most important thing that DSI, Decision Support Initiatives, ought to be focusing on are getting these no regrets analysis stood up, making sure that faculty can reclaim unproductive capacity by collapsing excess sessions, by looking for courses that have high drop-fail withdrawal rates, looking for indicators where the curriculum is getting too complex, and then teeing up the decisions that truly require faculty judgment about making the right trade-offs between mission and resources. How many small courses can we afford? What are we going to do with lower demand departments? And what is the right level of faculty workload? So I'll stop there. I hope I send you to your afternoons a little bit more confused at a higher level about where the world is going. But I'll send you back with two things, is that after a half decade of lip service, I am convinced that faculty are going to follow through on this, and that as a result, efforts concentrated on crosswalking files is going to come up, about coming up with UX for more intuitive decision support, and make sure that you argue back, that you constructively say no to your clients. Don't do 500 analyses, do 10, and make sure that we have correctly titrated the amount of staff effort for building new stuff versus data quality assurance on the old stuff. And those are the lessons I think that we can play back. So all of that's available on EAB.com, but I hope that I shrunk into 30 minutes, the better part of a conversation of the last 18 months. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Have a seat.
Okay.
So first we should introduce your colleague. I think your colleagues are traveling with you?
Yeah, please. I'd like to introduce Tracy Davis-Bradley. She is the head of our Information Technology Forum, which is our membership working with about 150 or so IT departments. Brad in Indiana did us the honor of helping launch that membership last year.
Well, very good. So as I was sitting in the audience and listening and thinking about all the folks here, and I was contemplating the meeting you showed at the beginning, the deans fussing about things and the provost and the chief business officer and all, and I need to just tell it to you straight. I think Florence sounds like more fun.
Things can be easier to manage than people, I guess.
Yeah. I think this is really an important thing for us to draw our attention to. So I invited Florence to talk about the Internet of Things and the innovation frontier, of the things that are going on and so dear to our hearts as technology professionals, being drawn into this field as part of our life work. But we've chosen to do our work inside higher education, the wondrous, enduring institutions of colleges and universities who are going through a great transformation in the economics of higher education. I just looked it up before coming back up here, and some of you, if you picked up on the piece I published a couple years ago, or when Mary Frances was with us last year, I believe it was at the closing luncheon, when you look at state funding going into higher education, the dollars per student coming from the taxpayers today are lower, and I don't mean economically or inflation adjusted, are lower numbers than the state was putting in per student almost 20 years ago. So you see the tuition run up, you see students starting to consider substitutes. So we are deeply involved in a renaissance and a retooling of our industry. So Chris, could you talk a little bit about, as many universities as you get around to, are there some that just really stand out, that they are really making progress in getting the information to the decision makers?
Yeah, there are a handful. Again, sadly, they probably could be named on one hand, maybe taking off one shoe.
Just don't say Purdue. Go ahead.
Never. There are a couple of usual suspects. We all get tired of hearing about Arizona State and Michigan. They are strong. We were, I guess surprised ought not to be the right word, but we were impressed about schools like Kent State, like the University of Maryland, Baltimore campus, places like Philadelphia University. For various reasons, they had significant economic curveballs thrown at them, either discontinuous drops in state funding, soft enrollments in the case of Philadelphia University. And I think what was the shared moment in all of those institutions' path towards getting sophisticated was the sense among the deans is that rather sort of share the suffering in silence and kind of settle into a diminished future, we're not going to wait. We are certainly going to continue advocating for higher education dollars, but we are going to do the best with the resources that we have. We're going to bootstrap. We are going to self-fund our mission by looking for opportunities to move resources from areas that might not be as productive to areas where we want to grow and where we want to be great.
Well, you mentioned Arizona State and President Michael Crow there. He has been quite a mover and shaker and innovator out there. And if you looked at sponsored research, at numbers of students and such, traditionally in that state between the University of Arizona and Arizona State, the curve trajectories are quite stark in terms of how much innovation has been going on there. So one question, you used the term a couple of times, performance-based funding. What does that mean?
Performance funding, in my sense of using that word, is an approach that's being taken by a growing number of state legislatures to link the amount of state appropriations, not just to the inputs, the number of enrollments, which it's traditionally been, but rather to student progress and completion. So there are the states that are furthest along that have attached the greatest amount of state funding to student progress and completion, again, are the state of Tennessee. The state of Ohio is following in its footsteps. And then there are a number of different states that are making it one of a number of different metrics where the impact is a little bit more diluted. But we see at a large level at the state and potentially maybe at the federal level that linking funding towards accumulation and completion of credits is going to be a bigger dimension. Tracking that in a consistent way and then getting the information to the academic decision makers that can do something about it is a very big deal in a lot of these states.
Well, it is here in the state of Indiana, and I didn't look up the exact numbers. I wish I had beforehand. But across all of our campuses, regional campuses, Indianapolis and Bloomington, I believe IU's take on performance-based metrics from the state last year was a net increase of around $5 or $6 million that we received for our performance. And that is students at Indiana University were completing their degrees in 4 years or 6 years. There's different metrics for each one. There's difference on part-time students and such. There are a few other metrics around it. But I will say the university performed remarkably well on the benchmarks that the state put out for us to be able to gain that kind of performance-based funding. So you talked a lot about the cost per credit hour. This is sounding very crass, like running a manufacturing automobile plant or something. How do we get higher ed to think about that in a way that is good for what we want to accomplish, but doesn't somehow devalue the whole of the academy? Your example was great. We're not going to move teaching Jacob's school piano to a section of 500. It would kill the very thing that it comes. So how do we talk about that in a sophisticated way?
The most constructive conversations informed by data that we have seen at these handful of schools that have much to teach always start with that the numbers are meant to inform decisions, not to dictate them. And they are true to that in the spirit and the letter of every conversation that they have. So when you're looking at trend lines in instructional costs per student credit hour, if you were seeing data like my example of political science versus sociology, one of the drivers of that was smaller class size. So what the academic discussion that comes out is that they are saying is that we are not in the business of maximizing profit or recovering costs. We are about something far more important than filthy lucre. On the other hand, we do have a finite amount of resources. Our department, we are young men and women in a hurry, and we want to win Nobel Prizes. We want to give people a leg up into the middle of class by graduating first-generation students. We want to do terrific things for our community. How can we free up resources that are unintentionally unproductively allocated so that we can have more to invest in quality, in mission? And put that way and with enough documented decisions where they go, Brad, I see about the small class size, but we're going to keep them small. We like the way it is. That makes all the difference, and really faculty decide how to make the trade-offs.
Yeah, I think the key point here is it enables us to be intentional.
Right.
We may be very intentional that we're going to put a full professor, someone highly accomplished in a small class size, in an honors section or in an applied section, and the net margin loss on that class is one of those parts of your graph. Or we may have some other kinds of courses that we've learned over time. We can teach them in large sections with quality faculty to great effect in measurement. And this goes into the learner analytics part of this as well. But in many cases, the university has not been intentional because we did not know the data, or if somebody wanted to begin this conversation, it was the battle of the spreadsheets. Oh, my data are different than yours, or you don't know, or you just don't understand. But moving in this direction being very, very important. For me, when I think about higher ed, and this is a completely imperfect analogy, but it is also a telling one. There was a time in the 1970s, I think people could say the United States automobile industry was in pretty bad disarray. The fuel spikes and the oil crisis of early 70s, quality was not there, and people used to laugh about brands like Honda or Nissan. It was literally a joke. And then what happened by the 1980s, these brands were sweeping through and becoming very, very popular. And big old lumbering Chrysler and General Motors and such had to learn how to pick up a lot of the data-driven practices of their Japanese counterparts. So if that took the auto industry about 20 years to figure it out, what's your time frame for us?
Conversation maybe to take us to dinner. Every time I am asked questions about how soon the demise of higher education is coming, I'm forced to note that out of the 50 longest continuously enduring institutions in the United States, I think about 46 of them are universities. So whatever antiquated practices you guys are clinging to, it's working to some extent. The way I might answer that question, though, is I do not think what higher education does will ever go away. But what I do think is that information and other options will allow people to unbundle parts of what you do into different parts that might really change your economics. So I might not want to take, as outstanding as the Indiana lower division experience might be, I might take that online or at a community college and then transfer into a particular discipline. If I wanted to get a particular technical training, I might source something with an employer sponsorship and only consume a couple of courses. I may try and take more and more IP classes. So I think really that what the data and forecasting challenge that you'll have is that it is very difficult for higher education to reduce the costs of what you do. It costs a lot to have this many great things with this many smart people. So where I think that students and their families and where government regulators and where the guys in the higher education entrepreneurial garage are taking it is that they are going to try and devise ways so that people can choose how much of what you produce they are required to consume to get where they want to go.
Well,
personally.
absolutely. The textbook publishers, they will all tell you, oh, no, we don't do those sultry things called textbooks. We're e-learning companies now, and they want to say very quickly, moving into a model of you take intro calculus literally from Pearson, and Pearson demonstrates your competency in calculus, and that may have cost less than taking it through a university. So if you look at first-year experience and students walking onto one of our campuses for the first time, many are arriving on campus with 15 hours, 30 hours, some even 40 hours of course credit already completed. And it really takes us into the question of, is online a complement to the things that we already do quite well in extension, like Kelly Direct, our online nursing degrees, or is it a substitute for things that have traditionally been part of the college experience? And that has enormous implications on our finance, as you would understand quite well. So I'm not sure if everyone knows. Aaron, did I see you standing over here somewhere? Yes. Aaron, you may want to stand up, and because you're the guy, that spiral he showed for it not to be a failed IT project. Yes. Aaron is leading our decision support initiative, a huge effort across the university, big 2-year sprint, all in about a $10 million investment, some of that reallocating staff and work that we had been doing already. But when you look at the work coming out of the Decision Support Initiative, you see what Chris said just in spades of how much of our time and energy is going into data definitions. So the same things mean the same things. And what's the timestamp on that? How does that roll up? Someone looking at it and go, that can't be right. And then you go, oh, actually that is right. After they dig into it just a little bit further. So this will be running through July of, not 16, but 17. We're deeply invested in this because we know we've got to get those 10 no regrets decisions right at Indiana University. Chris, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you.